Hello everybody. So I thought it would be fun to do a video where I talk about the most difficult or intimidating books for me on my TBR, on my to be read list. There are two main reasons why I'm considering a book difficult or intimidating. The first reason is that it is written in Spanish and I am not fluent enough to read a whole novel in Spanish, but I really want to be. So, and I don't have a problem with reading translations, books that were written in Spanish and were translated into English for the most part, but there are a few books that I feel like would be more meaningful and impactful for me if I read them in the original language. But, like I said, I think I'm still very much at an elementary school reading level when it comes to reading Spanish, and so I'm just not ready. So one of the books I actually have with me, I had gotten it thinking, oh, this will be great, it's probably more in my range of understanding, and so I can read this book to practice and eventually move on to bigger books. And it is El Límite de los Montes Negros by Patrick Carman. This one is interesting because it's actually originally was written in English. I just got it, I must have bought it at some sort of book sale or something, and I thought, oh, it's a book that I had seen this cover before for the English edition. I believe in English it is called The Dark Hills Divide, and it's a series, a young adult or even middle grade series. And so I knew it was kind of a popular book, so I might enjoy it. Not that if it wasn't popular, I wouldn't enjoy it. But basically, it seemed like a lot of people enjoyed these books. I believe it's more fantasy related. And yeah, so I've tried a couple times to start reading this book, and it is still a bit too far outside of my Spanish level, unfortunately. They're just, even getting through the first few pages, I was having to look up so many words. It's interesting too because I have gotten to the point with watching YouTube videos, for example, where there's one creator specifically that I watch, and I'll link her as well. I believe her channel is called Clow Reads Books, but she lives in, and I believe is from Mexico. Her videos are all in Spanish, and just the way that she pronounces words and her pace of speaking is slow enough for me to really be able to understand most of her videos. And so I think because of that, I had been feeling like, oh, I must know at least enough Spanish to get by, and so I'm sure reading a book it would be the same, but I think that even this book uses a bit more descriptive language that aren't necessarily found in her videos, because her videos are more talking about books and book summaries, and so a lot of them, I think she uses a lot more general language in those videos, as opposed to, like, in here, for example, there was a word that meant, like, shadowy. Things like that, where you really only find them in books or maybe lectures where people are trying to be very descriptive and set a scene. A lot of adjectives that I just realized I don't know. So this will probably be one of the first books that I do read when I finally feel like I can understand enough. And I mean, I haven't given up on it. I might pick it back up every once in a while and see how much I can work through. But so far, like I said, it's only been a few pages. The other book that, probably even before this one, I am hoping to get my hands on and take a crack at is A Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. There is apparently a version that has Spanish on one side and English on the other side, and so I think that that would be a good starting point for me, especially because it is such a small book. I feel like a lot of the language there is more simple, common words, and so I'm hoping that that would be easier for me to read, but definitely still on my intimidating reads list. And then we get into a bit higher level, just a couple books that I've heard of that sound interesting to me. Persona Normal by Benito Taibo. I don't remember what it's about. I just remember thinking it sounded interesting. And I believe that one is either YA or adult, so probably a higher level. El Eco del Destino by Ina G. Parente and Selene M. Pascual, which is the first book in a series. And Clow, the YouTuber I follow, really liked that book. From my understanding, it's a fantasy, and I believe it surrounds a character who has some sort of device that has a great power and no one is supposed to use it, but then his friend dies? Someone he's close to dies, and maybe it was his lover, and he decides to use it. I think that's what what was happening from the summary that I got in Spanish. It sounded interesting. And then the book that Clow herself wrote, El Príncipe del Sol, that's also part of a series, and I just love her channel so much. And so I would love to support her, and I'm curious to read the books that she's written. I know that one is a fantasy as well. And then the probably most intimidating book on the Spanish books list for me is Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And that one is definitely, I'm sure, going to have more difficult descriptive language. But I feel like because it is such a classic, and I know so many people that have loved that book, I really want my first experience reading it to be in the language it was written, to just make sure that I am getting the full experience, the way that the language flows and is meant to flow, all of those little nuances and cultural meanings that you don't necessarily get or don't get as easily when a book has been translated. Because I do feel like in different languages there can be, I mean, for one, of course there are words that aren't really translatable to another language, but also, like I said, if there's any sort of rhyming or alliteration or things like that, that might be a lot harder to translate into English, as well as any sort of cultural or linguistic references. I'm hoping that by the time I read that book in Spanish that I will know enough to be able to fully appreciate it as it was initially written. So that is the first category of books that are intimidating to me. The second category is books that are really long. I don't have a problem with reading long books. It's just that if it is not really engaging and fast-paced, then I do start to feel more like I'm slogging through it, and sometimes I can get a little tired of it. And also it just is intimidating because I feel like I've kind of gotten into this mode, especially with doing the reading challenges, which I'm glad I've been doing them, but when you have this challenge of read this many books in a week or in a month, then you're less likely to, or I'm less likely to pick up bigger books because I want to make sure that I hit all my quotas. And I don't want to be thinking like that all the time because I think that there are some amazing big books out there, of course. And so some of the books that are on my list that I really do want to get to, two of them are actually by Brandon Sanderson. I've heard that a good one to start with by him is Mistborn. And it's funny because it's 657 pages, and I have read books longer than that, but I think also because I know Brandon Sanderson writes epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is another genre that intimidates me because I do prefer a fast read. I really like books that explore characters and their relationships to other characters and their own personal struggles. And I feel like a lot of times high fantasy can have that stuff, but I think a lot of times it also focuses more on the big picture, battles, politics, things like that, and I'm not always as interested in those elements. And also when there's a lot of characters to keep track of, sometimes I forget who people are, and then it's just not as entertaining for me. But I think one thing that I might want to start doing with epic fantasy is maybe start annotating, putting tabs in whenever there's a new character introduced so I can have an easier time of remembering. Also, I think I'll just need to really focus on taking my time with the book and not worrying about rushing. The other book by Brandon Sanderson that I've heard is really good is Way of Kings. I know that Way of Kings and Mistborn are both series, but Way of Kings, the first book, is 1,007 pages. So that is, I mean, that would be the longest book that I've read in a while, not counting this book that I read with my boyfriend. But other than that, I don't usually read books that are over 1,000 pages. So that one's definitely a little daunting. Another big chonker is The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. And that one as well, I don't know if I'll enjoy it or not, because it's 1,092 pages, and I remember when it first came out, I think they were talking about it on Oprah. That was when I had first heard about it, unless I'm thinking of a different book. But what I remember was that it got a lot of praise, but it was kind of just about these people living their lives, maybe multiple generations in like a long time ago. I'm not usually a big historical fiction person, and I do read books where there's no fantasy or anything like contemporary fiction, but again, I haven't read one that's that long before, so we'll see. I do think that I might like it because I heard that there is a big focus on the characters themselves, and so that might be enough to keep me interested, but it's definitely one that I'm a little hesitant to start. And then the last one in that category is actually another one that isn't, I mean, it's half the length. It's Babel by R.F. Kuang. So again, I've read books that long or longer, but I just love R.F. Kuang's writing and her stories so much, and I've read everything else that she's written as far as I'm aware. So I think there's just like that extra bit of pressure of I'm hoping that I'll like it, but because it's a bit longer, I'm worried that I won't enjoy it as much, that I might get bored. I know it deals with academia and language, which is another thing that I really enjoy reading about and learning about. And so then there's also that thought of like, oh, but what if it's too dry, or what if I don't enjoy it? So that's another one that I just need to push myself and start reading, because I'm sure I will like it. So those were the two main categories, like I said. There is one other book that is difficult for me to read, but it's because it's actually physically difficult for me to read in the way that I want. And I got this book without realizing the situation. This book is Ship of Theseus. I've also heard it called S by V.M. Straka. And the reason that this one is hard for me is because I got it from the thrift store. I was so excited because it's been on my list for a while. Because this is another book where it's, I don't know if multimedia is the right, well, I think it is, but basically it just has so many different elements. I think there are 3 different stories, because you have the main written story, but then there are characters that are writing annotations in the margins, and they have their own stories going on. So I thought, oh yeah, that's really cool. I'm super excited to start this. But then I was watching another person talk about this book, and what I didn't realize was that there's actual other pieces of paper and postcards and newspaper articles and what have you that are supposed to go with this book if you buy it new. So I guess whenever they sold this to, or gave this to the thrift store, they didn't include all those extra pieces. And so I don't want to read it as is because I don't want to miss out on those pieces. And I know I could probably just look them up online, but I'd rather have them physically in my hand. So I really don't know what I'm going to do with this book. I don't necessarily want to buy it new. I'm sure it's expensive, and I already have half of it. I'm just going to have to hold on to it for a bit, and we'll see what happens. So those are the, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11 books, I believe, that are the most intimidating or difficult for me to read. I would love to get through a couple of them at least this year, but we'll see what happens. Thanks for watching.